Welcome to this deep dive. We're here to really unpack a complex topic by looking at a whole range of sources.
That's right. We take all this information, distill it down, and give you the key insights.
We sift through it all to pull out the key
we're tackling
insights,
the anthropological and sociological study of religion.
To speed.
We've got academic
Think of it
journals,
as us
bits from
doing
books,
the heavy
even
lifting,
some
showing you
blog
what the
posts.
material
Yeah, a
itself
real
actually
mix.
says.
We're looking at it
Exactly.
from
And
all
for
sorts
this
of
deep
angles:
dive, you brought something
sociological,
really
cognitive
fascinating.
science,
A set of
anthropology,
sources looking at
even
the connections
Marxist
and
and
parallels
Weberian
between
perspectives.
ancient
Our mission
mystery
really
religions
is to
and
pull out
early
the crucial
Christianity.
ideas about
Some
what
are quite
religion is
surprising.
Yeah,
and
they really
how
are.
it works in the world.
Our
We want to
mission
make it
here
clear
is
and
to
engaging
unpack what these
for
sources
you,
tell us,
the listener.
get a feel for that
If you're
historical
curious,
context,
if you want to get up to speed on
where early
complex stuff
Christian
without getting
traditions
bogged
were
down,
forming.
We'll
this is
touch
for
on
you.
ancient goddesses,
We're aiming for those aha
stories of death and
moments.
resurrection.
We want to
that seem
synthesize
pop
all
up
these
in
different views
places
to
Some
give you a
pretty
clear
intense
picture
rituals,
of
even
religion's
shared
role,
sacred days.
both
And we'll see how
socially
these
and
old ideas
personally.
connect to a
Absolutely.
very
Think of
current
it as
debate
connecting
about
the
how a
dots
major
between these
figure
different
in
ways of
Christianity
thinking
is
about
seen
something
today.
so fundamental
let's
to
get
human
into it.
experience.
All right. Okay, so let's dive in. Where do we start?
Maybe the
Maybe
best
with
place
the
to start
basics, like how do we
is
even
with this
define
foundational
religion
idea
Yeah.
of one of the sources.
this idea of
sort of
the
sets
sacred.
the scene.
Good starting
It
point.
suggests that
A lot of the sources bring up
um,
Durkheim.
underneath all the
He saw
surface
religion
stuff
as
in
fundamentally
religion,
collective,
the
tied to the
words,
group,
the specific
community.
beliefs, the ceremonies,
The church,
There's this
we called it,
constant
but
thing,
not
a
necessarily
spiritual
a
order,
building.
like a
Right.
fundamental
More
human
like the
drive.
community
That's the
of
idea.
believers.
Right.
The
Precisely.
source calls it the
community,
ever-living
and
search
for
of
him,
men
the
for
absolute
higher
core
life,
of it was this
a
distinction
fuller
made
life,
between
more
the sacred
abundant,
and
satisfying
the profane.
life. Ah, yes,
That's
the
basic
sacred
human
versus the
quest.
profane.
So that
Can you
deep
unpack
inner
that a little?
search
What's the
is
key
always
difference?
there,
Well,
no
simply
matter
put,
the
the
time or
sacred is
place.
anything that's
And
set
this source
apart,
makes a point
special,
that even
powerful,
as the
maybe even
outer
forbidden,
manifestations of
treated
religion
with
change,
reverence.
because
Okay, and
experience
the
and knowledge
profane.
grow,
That's just everyday life.
that core search
Ordinary
continues.
stuff.
So it
Mundane
gives us a way to think
reality.
about
And
similarities
Durkheim
across
argued
religions.
this division, this
Could they
sharp
be,
line,
like,
is
different ways of expressing
essential.
the
You
same
can't really have
fundamental
religion
search.
without it.
That's
Right,
a
the
really
fundamental
interesting
split
lens,
in how
seeing
things
the
are perceived.
universal human
An
element
irreducible
alongside all the
dichotomy
different
as the
historical
source
expressions.
Okay.
Now,
Okay, with that
here's where it
framework,
gets,
let's look at
I
some
think, really
specific
fascinating.
mystery religions the sources bring up
Durkheim
and
said
these
the power
parallels
of the
they
sacred
mention.
doesn't come from
one that gets a lot of
outer
attention in the
space or
material
some
is
deity
the cult
directly,
of
but
But from the
Cybele and
social group
Attis.
itself,
Yeah,
yes.
Cybele.
He
She's the great
argued
mother.
that the feeling
An
of
ancient
power,
figure,
the awe
Anatolian
you feel towards
origins,
the sacred, is
maybe
actually the
going way,
feeling
way
of the
back.
group's
Older than
power
many of the
over
others we
the
might talk
individual.
about.
Society
yes,
itself is
significantly.
the source.
She was
That was
sometimes
his
called
argument.
Mother of the
Society is this
Mountain, or
force,
even
it's
born
bigger than
from
us, it
stone.
existed before
Really
us, it will
tied
exist
to
after
the
us.
earth,
We
to
depend
nature.
on it. And visually,
all
she's
these
often
things, the
shown with
community, the
lions,
family,
right?
the
Powerful
nation.
animals.
Yes,
They become
exactly.
symbolized.
The sources
Right.
mention her as
Through
mistress
names,
of animals,
flags,
Theron.
totems in
Often
some
she's got
societies,
lions
stories,
beside her,
songs,
or they're pulling her
dances,
chariot.
and,
That
of
imagery
course,
itself
gods.
seems pretty old,
These are all
maybe
symbols
borrowing
of
from
social
places like Minoan
realities.
Crete.
So when people worship
Now,
these
Cybele and
symbols, they're
Attis are usually
actually
linked,
actually
but the myths
celebrating
are
the group.
apparently a bit
Recognizing their own
Yeah, the sources
collective
say it
identity and
confused tangled
power.
myths.
It's society
But
representing
what's key
itself,
for us are the
worshiping
common
itself in a
threads,
way.
especially
That
this
is
annual
quite a
Roman
perspective
festival.
shift.
Right? The festival, what
The
was
god
that
of the
about?
clan.
It celebrated
can
Attis'
therefore be
death and
nothing else
resurrection,
than the clan
and it
itself.
ran from March
Personified.
22nd to the 25th.
Exactly that quote.
And this is
The
where the
totemic
sources start
principle
drawing
is the
some really
clan,
direct lines to
imagine.
early Christianity.
So
March
religion,
22nd to
at its
25th,
core,
that
is
timing
society
definitely
reflecting
rings a bell.
on itself.
it does.
Okay, let's shift
The
focus
sources
a bit.
highlight that
Anthropology
in places
offers
where
a slightly
Attis
different
worship
angle,
was
right?
big, like
Describing
Phrygia,
religion
Gaul,
as
Italy, Christians
an
actually
extrapolation
adopted
of
March
culture.
25th as the
Culture to the
anniversary of
ultimate.
our
What's
Lord's
that getting
Passion.
Well,
Wow,
it
the
highlights
exact
how
date
taken from
deeply
an
embedded
existing pagan
religion is
festival
within
what
the
about the
whole
rituals
cultural
during
systems,
those
not
days? Any
separate.
parallels there?
Oh,
And
absolutely. The
crucially,
sources detail
the
it.
beings
On
or
March
forces
22nd,
in
they fasten
religions,
an effigy
spirits,
of Attis
gods,
to a pine
whatever,
tree.
they're almost
An
always
effigy,
seen
like a
as
statue or
social.
figure.
Social,
Yeah,
even when they're
representing
like nature
and the source
spirits or
description
ancestors.
is striking.
Yes.
Way.
He
They're
was
treated
slain
as
and
having
hanged on a
qualities
tree.
of persons
Then
or
this
agents. You
effigy
can have a
was buried in
relationship
a
with them.
tomb.
You communicate.
Slain
they
and
have
hanged on a
intentions,
tree,
there's
buried. I mean, the
reciprocity.
language, the
So
sequence,
we interact
it's
with
very
ancestors,
close to the
spirits,
passion
gods,
story.
even
It's closer.
impersonal forces,
March
almost as if they're
24th
part of
was
the
the Day
social
of
world.
Blood.
Pretty much.
On this
The
day, the
anthropological
high
view
priest,
suggests
acting
we
as
extend our
Attis,
social
would actually draw
understanding, our
blood
ways
from
of
his own
relating
arm.
to
From
these
himself.
non-human
offering it
entities
as a
that become
sacrifice.
part of this
And one
social
source
landscape.
explicitly connects
connects
Interesting.
this
So the subject might be different from
substitution
politics,
to the
say,
epistle,
but the
to
way
the
we
Hebrews,
engage is
where it
still
talks about Christ
fundamentally
as high
social.
priest redeeming
That's a
us
good
by
way
his
to
own
put it.
blood.
That's
It's
incredible.
using our
Linking a
social
pagan
toolkit to interact with
substitutionary
the
blood
non-material
ritual
world.
directly to a
Okay,
core
now for a
Christian
completely
idea.
different approach.
And then the climax.
Cognitive
That night,
science
the
of
priest would
religion.
find the
What's their
tomb
starting
empty.
point?
Well, first
The
off,
God had
they
risen on the
tend to
third
reject
day.
the
Empty
idea
tomb,
that
risen on the
religion
third
is
day.
totally
So March
unique,
25th became this huge
sui
celebration,
generis
rejoicing
thing
for the
that
resurrection.
can't be studied
Death,
scientifically.
burial,
So they think we
empty
can study it
tomb,
like any
resurrection
other
on the third
cultural
day,
thing, like
celebration,
art
the
or
structure, the
language.
timing.
Exactly.
It's
They
really hard
operate
to
under
miss
what's
the
called
parallels.
methodological naturalism.
During the celebration,
Methodological
initiates would have a
naturalism,
kind of
meaning-
sacramental
Meaning
meal.
you look for
and they were
natural
baptized with blood.
explanations.
Baptized
You don't
with
just
blood.
accept a
Yes,
which
religious
was believed
explanation
to
like God
wash
did
away
it as the
sins, make
scientific
them
answer.
born again.
You look
A
for the
sacred meal
cognitive or
baptism for
evolutionary
rebirth.
mechanisms behind
These are
the
such
belief or practice.
central concepts in Christianity.
And they bring in
It really
evolution
sounds
and how
like the
our brains
sources
are wired, don't
suggesting
they?
heavily.
Attis
The idea is that our
practices
minds
created
aren't
a kind
like
of
pre-existing
slates.
framework. The way our brains
That's
evolved,
certainly
the
what the
cognitive
juxtaposition
capacities we all
implies.
share,
The
shapes
sources
the kinds
also
of
briefly
cultural
mention
forms,
other
including
things
religious
like
ones
the priesthood,
that
the
tend to stick
Gallic.
around.
They
They
were
were
looking
known
for
for
the underlying
ecstatic
reasons
practices,
why
even
certain religious ideas or
Right. A
patterns
very
keep
intense
popping up
form of
across
devotion.
different
and
cultures.
rituals like the
Precisely.
Torbolium, sacrificing
What are
the
the
bull, maybe
universal
being
mental
bathed
factors,
in the blood
the
for
cognitive
purification.
biases or
Pretty vivid
tendencies
stuff.
that
Definitely
might
vivid.
make humans
Okay, who else do the
predisposed to
sources
things like
highlight with
believing in
these kinds of
supernatural
parallels?
agents or
Adonis.
participating in rituals? They
His
want the
worship
causal
is another one
mechanisms.
noted as
Okay, let's circle back to
influencing early
Durkheim for a
Christian
moment,
thought.
specifically on social dynamics.
Antioch, which was
He
really
argued
important
religion
early
creates
Christian
social
center,
solidarity,
had a big
right? It
annual
binds
celebration
Yes,
for Adonis'
absolutely.
death
He
and
saw
resurrection.
rituals
Adonis?
as key here.
I feel like I've heard
Participating
that
together
name
in
connected to
rituals
Jewish tradition
reinforces
too.
You're
those
right.
shared
One source
feelings,
brings that
those
up. It points to the prophet
collective sentiments we talked
Ezekiel,
about. It upholds the group's
scolding women in
values.
Jerusalem.
Max
right
Weber
at the
comes
temple
along
gate
with a bit of a
for
counterpoint.
weeping
Right.
for
Weber
Tammuz,
said,
who was
hang on,
identified
religion
with
isn't
Adonis.
always
Weeping
about
for a
keeping
pagan
things the
god
same.
at the
It
gate
can
of
be
the
a
Jerusalem
major
temple
force
that
for
really
change.
shows
Like the
how
Protestant
widespread these
Reformation.
ideas
That was
were,
his prime
even interacting
example.
with Judaism.
He argued
And here's
certain
another
Protestant
detail from the
beliefs
sources that's
created
pretty
an ethic
striking.
that was
The
incredibly
place early
conducive to the
Christians
development
identified
of
as
capitalism.
Jesus' birthplace in
So
Bethlehem.
religious
Yeah.
ideas
According to
actually
one
drove
source, it was
massive
actually a
social and
former
economic
shrine to
transformation.
Adonis.
So
It
religion
suggests
can be
this might have even
both
caused some
conservative
confusion
and
locally,
revolutionary,
people
depending
mixing
on
up
the
Adonis and
Exactly.
Jesus.
It's not just one thing. It interacts
So the
with
location
society in
itself
really
might have had
complex
this
ways.
older religious layer
Durkheim
that got
also had that
reinterpreted.
concept
That adds a
of
whole other dimension to
effervescence.
Bethlehem.
The
That
Adonis
intense
myth involves a
feeling
cruel
during
death,
rituals.
Yes.
a descent into hell or
effervescence.
Hades,
Think of
rising
the
again,
feeling in a
and then
crowd
ascending
at
to
a
heaven.
concert
Again, that
or a
sequence,
huge
death,
political
descent,
rally.
resurrection,
That shared
ascension.
excitement, that energy.
And his festival
Durkheim
involved
saw something
mourning
similar
his
in
death,
religious rituals. A
ritually
kind of psychological
washing and
force
anointing an
generated
effigy
by
for
the
burial,
collective gathering.
celebrating the
It makes
resurrection.
people feel connected,
maybe even using
united,
the phrase,
maybe even
"The
highly
Lord is
suggestible.
risen." And
Before
this
the Christians
reinforces
used
their
it,
commitment to the
potentially,
group.
yes.
That was
And
the idea.
one
In
source
that heightened
pushes
state,
further,
you feel the power of the
suggesting the whole idea of
collective, your
Jesus
individual
descending into
boundaries
hell,
might
which is
seem
in
to
the creed.
dissolve a
Right.
bit,
He
and your
descended into
commitment to the
hell.
shared
It
values
might have been
gets,
borrowed from
well,
Adonis and others.
recharged.
The source
talk
notes,
about belief.
It appears sort of later in
It
church
seems so
theology,
central,
maybe
but
late
some
4th
anthropologists
century,
really
and
question
argues
our
it hasn't got a
assumptions about
strong
it.
basis in the
Spiro,
very
for
early
instance,
scriptures.
warned against
These aren't
assuming
just
everyone in the
vague
group
feelings
believes the
of
same
similarity,
thing
are
in the
they?
same
They're
way.
specific
That's a
story
really important
points,
question.
rituals,
Just because
phrases.
there's a stated
What about
doctrine
Egypt?
or a religious expert
Osiris
doesn't
and
mean
Isis?
every single
Ah,
person
yes, Osiris
understands
and
or
Isis.
experiences that
Cited as a
belief
major
identically.
influence, especially
There's
the
room
sources
for individual
suggest,
variation.
on how Mary,
And
the
then
mother
Needham
of
went
Jesus,
even further,
came to be
questioning if
venerated in the
belief
Catholic
itself
tradition.
is even
How
a
so? What's the
universal
connection there?
psychological state.
Well, Isis
Right.
had two
He argued
really key
that
aspects.
what we call belief
She
in
was the
English,
grieving
especially
lady
in
of
the West,
sorrows,
might not
weeping
map
for her
neatly
murdered
onto
husband,
psychological
Osiris.
states or concepts in
And
other
she was the
cultures.
divine mother,
The very
shown
idea
nursing
might be
her infant
culturally
son,
specific.
Horus.
The sources
The
break
source
down
connects that
belief in
sorrowing
English into
aspect
different
to
senses,
Demeter,
don't they?
mourning
Like
Persephone
believing that
it
something is
alludes to.
true versus believing
And the mother
in
and
someone
child
like trust
aspect.
versus
Horus.
believing in something
That's where the
like
visual link gets
commitment
really
to a
strong.
value.
Exactly.
ISIS was hugely
Propositional
popular.
belief,
There were,
trust
the
or
source says,
confidence,
tens
and
of
commitment or
thousands of
value. And these
statuettes
can be
and
bundled
paintings
together or
were
kept
holding
separate
the
in
divine
different languages
child.
and
Tens
religious
of
systems.
thousands.
So
our
our
typical
typical
Western,
Western,
Christianity
maybe
became
Christian
dominant.
influenced,
These
these
exact
exact
same
same
belief.
images were often just
Mixing
relabeled.
fact,
They became
trust,
the Madonna
value
and
isn't
child,
the only way.
sometimes
Definitely
with little or
not.
no difference.
Many
So
religious
people might not have
traditions don't
even
have
noticed
formal
the
creeds in
change
the same
visually.
way.
Exactly.
Or they
It
might
apparently caused
emphasize
confusion for
orthopraxy,
later
correct
archaeologists
practice
trying to
over
date
orthodoxy,
things. Is it
correct
Isis or
belief.
is it Mary?
The history
visual
of the
type
word
was just
belief
adopted.
itself in the West
That's a
shows
powerful
how it
image of
shifted
cultural
from trust
adaptation,
to
taking beloved
propositions to
existing
personal
forms for
experience.
the new faith.
That's a specific
And the Osiris
cultural
myth itself.
trajectory.
Okay, murder.
Moving on to spirits
Isis
and gods.
finds him.
What's the
brings us
basic
back in a
common
way. He
ground
becomes
there?
king of
Well,
the dead.
the fundamental thing
Horus
is they're
rules on
usually
earth.
seen as
And
individuals.
like
They
the
have
others,
minds,
Osiris
wills,
had his own
personalities.
annual
There's
festival
agency
of death and
involved.
But there's a
resurrection.
spectrum, right?
4
from
days in
spirits to
November.
gods.
Another
Levy
death and resurrection
Maggio
festival.
and Howard
Any date
suggest
links
thinking
between
about
Isis
it as a
and Mary
continuum.
specifically. distinguished
One
by a
source
few
floats an
things,
idea about Mary's
structure
Assumption
gods
Festival,
often
August
tied
13th.
to big social
It
institutions,
suggests this
spirits
date
more marginal.
coincided with a major festival for Diana
What
or
else?
Artemis goddesses.
Personhood gods
Isis was
often
sometimes
seem more
linked to it.
fully human in their
Implying
social
that maybe
nature.
Mary's
Spirits
festival
may be
was
more
deliberately
fluid or
placed on that
minimally
date
persons.
to eventually absorb or
Experience,
replace
interestingly,
the
spirits
goddess's
are often
popular
encountered
festival.
more directly
That
than
suggests
gods
more
in
conscious
everyday
strategy of adaptation rather than
That's
just things developing
counterintuitive.
in parallel.
It can seem that
Okay,
way.
what about the
And finally,
Eleusinian mysteries
morality.
and grace?
Gods are
Right,
usually tied
Eleusis,
to the moral
a
order,
very famous
maybe even
Greek
enforcing
cult
it.
active for
Spirits can be morally
centuries, definitely well
ambiguous
known
outside
in
the
the
main
first
system,
century
sometimes
CE,
even seen as
as
when
evil or
Christianity
just
was
causing
started.
trouble? What is the core story
So
there?
gods are
It's
sort of the
centered on
establishment
Persephone,
figures
snatched
away
away
by
by
the
Pluto,
big
the god of the
picture,
underworld.
and spirits are more
Her
like
mother, Demeter, the
local
goddess of
agents,
grain and
may
life,
be
is
unpredictable.
devastated.
That's a
And the
decent
earth
way to think
becomes
about it.
barren. Gods
Exactly.
provide the model for order.
Demeter grieves
Spirits
so much,
often represent
nothing
threats
grows.
to it, or
She
things
only
operating
relents when
outside
Persephone
it.
is allowed
And
back.
this ties into
But
ideas
because
about
Persephone
misfortune
ate a
and what
pomegranate
happens
seed
after
down
death,
there,
right?
she has
The
to return
Burmese
to the
example with
underworld
different
for
kinds of
part of
ghosts.
each year.
Yes,
Usually
it shows the
seen as
variety.
explaining the seasons,
Beliefs
right?
about
Winter
the
death,
afterlife,
spring
what
rebirth.
happens to the soul
That's the
or
nature myth
spirit, are incredibly
interpretation, yes.
diverse.
But the sources
Sometimes
stress
the dead
its
remain
human meaning
involved,
too.
sometimes
It touched on
benignly,
joy,
sometimes causing
sorrow,
problems, like
love,
the Tessie or
loss,
Fae
fear of
ghosts
death,
mentioned.
but also
And
hope.
when bad things
Hope
happen,
for reunion
people
with
don't
loved
always
ones
blame a
after
high
death.
god.
And what did Eleusis
Sometimes it's
offer people
ancestors
facing
or even
those
other
big
humans,
human
witches.
questions?
It seems it offered more than
Like
just
the
a vague
Azande
hope.
example.
Right,
The
attribution of
sources say
misfortune
it
is
gave
complex.
initiates a
It can
definite
be
assurance of a
spirits,
happy
gods,
afterlife.
human malice, or even just bad luck.
That's a
or the
powerful
nature of
offering,
things,
isn't
like
it?
dukkha, another strong point of
Buddhism.
connection with the
Or think
promises
of the
early
ancient Greek
Christianity.
gods often portrayed
Okay,
as
last one on this list,
arbitrary and not
Mithraism.
necessarily
Mithraism,
concerned with
popular
human
especially
justice.
with Roman soldiers.
Let's talk symbols
and
and
interestingly,
language.
Tarsus, St.
Joseph
Paul's
Campbell's
hometown,
idea that
was a
religious
major
symbols point
center for
beyond
Mithras
themselves
worship.
Paul's
mystery.
hometown. Okay.
God is not
What
a fact.
influences do the sources
Campbell
suggest came from
emphasizes the
Mithraism?
transcendent,
Several things. Mithras
unnameable
was said to be
quality
born
that
from a
symbols
rock,
evoke.
sometimes
But then you
called
have
the
someone
god
like
out
Dan
of the rock.
Sperber who
from a rock.
questions
Yeah.
if that search for deep
And his
hidden
worship
meaning is
often happened in
universal
caves
or
called
more of a
Mithraea.
Western intellectual habit.
The source suggests
Maybe
the early
symbolism
Christian
is more
tradition of
straightforward
Jesus
and
being
cultural.
born in a cave
So, is the meaning
might actually come
inherent,
from
or do we
these
impose it?
Mithraeic ideas.
The classic
The
debate.
cave
It is,
birthplace.
and religious
Another
language
very
isn't just
specific
myths and
parallel.
stories,
Yes.
right?
No,
And
definitely not.
one source goes so far
Prayer,
as to suggest
incantations,
that when
songs,
St. Paul
proverbs,
talks about the
liturgy,
spiritual rock
loads of
that
different
was
forms.
Christ,
And we need to think
he
about
might
not
be
just the
directly
content,
borrowing
what the words
or
say, but
adapting
the
language
performance, how
from
it's
Mithraic
said,
scripture.
sung,
Wow,
chanted,
a
in
direct
what context.
linguistic echo,
Right,
the
not
meaning
just the
isn't just
theme.
in
Then
the
there are the
text.
holy days.
Myth
Christians
itself,
move their
the
main day
sources
of worship
define
from
as
the
a
Jewish
sacred
Sabbath,
narrative,
Saturday to
often
Sunday.
about
Right.
origins
The
or
sources say,
supernatural
yeah,
beings.
partly for the
A
resurrection, but also
subgenre of
suggest it was
folklore.
largely
And
because it was
crucially,
the
often
weekly
existing
festival of the
as
sun.
oral literature. It
Sunday
lives in
was
the telling,
Mithras'
in the
sacred day,
performance.
linked
So
to the sun
analyzing
god.
just the plot or
So
structure
Sunday
might
itself,
miss a
the
lot.
main Christian
Which brings
worship
us
day,
back to
could
action.
have roots in a
Religion isn't
pagan
just
sun
thinking, it's
festival
doing.
connected to Mithras.
Malinowski's point
That's
is
what
a
the
mode of
sources
action.
imply.
Absolutely
They also point out
fundamental.
Mithras was
Ritual
often
is
called
where belief
Lord.
gets enacted.
So the
And
Lord's Day
rituals are
might have been a
often
Mithraic
really
term for
complex
Sunday before
performances.
Christians used it
Multi-part,
in Christmas.
multimedia.
December 25th.
What do you mean multimedia?
Jesus' actual
Well, they involve
birth date
language,
is unknown,
but also
right?
maybe dance,
But December
music,
25th was
special
Mithras'
clothing,
traditional
masks,
birthday.
specific
The church only
gestures,
adopted it for Christmas in the
silence,
4th century.
handling
December
sacred
25th and
objects,
Sunday.
eating special foods.
Two
It's a
massive
whole
dates in
sensory
the Christian
experience
calendar.
often.
And they have
potentially
recurring
linked to
features
pagan
like
origins.
Action,
Yeah.
definitely.
The
Patterning, they
sources
follow a
list other
set structure,
similarities
often
too.
highly
Sunday,
formalized.
Holy Day,
Repetition
December
is key.
25 birthday,
And communication,
rituals
though,
like
as Catherine
baptism
Bell
and
notes,
communion,
sometimes the
the idea
communicative
of converts
aspect
being
isn't obvious,
reborn,
or maybe it's even
the struggle
felt to be
between good and
empty by
evil,
some
belief in
participants.
immortality,
But the form is
a
still
mediator
important.
figure,
Formality,
sacraments,
fixity,
high ethical
repetition.
standards.
That's quite a
Those
list
are
when you put it all
hallmarks.
And
together.
Durkheim
It
saw
is.
rituals
And the
as a place
sources
where
note
commitment
these
happens,
parallels
where
were
that
so
effervescence
obvious even
reinforces
back
the
then
social bond.
that some people thought
Exactly.
Christianity
Ritual is
itself
the
had just
process
become
of
another mystery
representing
cult,
and recommitting
with
to
Jesus
those
as the
social
divine
facts,
Lord
those
showing the way to
collective
heaven,
values. It's
leaving
where
secrets for
society
his followers.
strengthens itself
This historical
emotionally.
dive
clearly,
really paints a
religion
picture of the
changes.
early Roman
It's
Empire
not
as this
static.
incredibly
Even traditional ones
interconnected
evolve.
religious
Oh,
world.
absolutely. The
Ideas
sources
and
talk about
practices were just
religious
flowing
fields
back
where
and
different
forth.
ideas
It
and
definitely makes it
practices
hard
are
to see these
constantly
traditions as
interacting and
developing in
influencing each
total
other.
isolation.
And in modern
Absolutely.
times,
Okay.
with
So
faster
we've looked at these
communication and
historical
cultural
parallels.
mixing,
Now let's
that
see how some of
change
these
often
same
accelerates.
themes
And we
pop up
see
in a
new
really
religious
modern
movements
context
and
you found in the
RMs popping up.
sources.
There
this
are ways
online
to
discussion
categorize
about
them.
Mary.
Yeah,
Right. This
Wallace
source is
looked at
different.
how
It's a
they
Reddit
relate
thread.
to the
And
outside world.
the core
Are they
argument from one
rejecting it,
user is
affirming
basically
it,
that
or just
Catholic and
accommodating
Orthodox
it?
veneration of Mary
Anthony and others
is just
looked at their response to
repackaged
cultural
goddess
norms
worship.
dualistic.
Okay, so connecting
seeing
these
good
historical
versus
points
evil, or
directly
monistic,
to a current
seeing
theological
underlying
debate.
unity.
So
What's
different
their reasoning?
strategies for
How do
relating
they
to the
support
mainstream.
that
Right,
claim?
and you have things like
Well, they
cult movements
argue a
forming
lot of
around
key Marian
specific beliefs and
beliefs,
rituals,
things like her
sometimes
perpetual
becoming new
virginity, her
sects
own
or
miraculous
churches.
conception,
And
the idea
revitalization
she was raised in the temple like a Vestal
interesting.
Virgin.
They often emerge in
They
times
don't come
of
from
great
the main
stress or
Gospels.
rapid change
Where do they
when
come
the old
from
ways just don't
They
seem to
trace
work
them to later
anymore.
texts,
There's
like
a
the Infancy
mismatch
Gospel
between
of
beliefs
James.
and reality.
And this user argues
these
these
movements
ideas
try
look
to
a lot
create a
like things you
new,
find
more
in Greco-Roman
satisfying cultural
cults,
system.
not so much in Jewish
The
tradition
Vila
at the time.
madness in
They claim
Papua
there's
is
no
cited
real
as an
historical
example
basis for
of
similar
response to colonial
practices in
impact.
Judaism. Okay.
So the
What
argument
about the
is
big world
these
religions?
core Marian
Christianity,
ideas seem
Islam,
to originate
Buddhism,
outside the Bible,
etc.
potentially
The
drawing
sources
on
say
existing
they aren't
pagan
really
models.
monolithic. That's
Not
the
at
thrust
all.
of
That's
it.
a key
They
takeaway.
also argue
They look
Mary is
very
treated like
different
a
on the ground in
quasi-divine
different
figure,
places.
or
think of Christianity
has
in Brazil
properties
versus,
of a
say,
goddess.
South Korea.
How so?
Because
It's
people
better to
believe
see
she
them as
hears and
huge
answers
umbrellas
prayers,
covering
performs
countless local
miracles, the
variations
astounds.
and
They
adaptations.
mentioned the Sundance
They're
at
constantly
Fatima as
interacting
an
with
example
local
attributed to her.
cultures.
And when
They
people
basically
convert,
say she's
it's
worshipped
not always
like
a
a
goddess
goddess suddenly
with
agreeing
specific
with all the
prayers and
doctrines.
celebrations
Often
aimed
not.
at her.
Motivations
So they're
are
looking
really
at the
diverse.
function,
It could be a
what
powerful
people believe
personal
Mary
experience,
does, and
finding
saying
the
it
moral
looks like
values
goddess worship.
appealing,
Exactly.
seeing
They
practical
claim
advantages,
all
maybe
objective
social
evidence
pressure, or the
points to her
prestige
being
associated
revered
with the
this
new
way,
religion. It's
taking
complex.
on roles and titles
So world
of earlier
religions
goddesses.
meet local
They
contexts.
see it as an
and you get
idolatrous
syncretism,
deviation
adaptation,
from monotheism,
all sorts
maybe
of
a
outcomes.
way to kind
Exactly.
of
They are
absorb or
dynamic
continue
assortments of
those older
multifarious local
goddess
things,
traditions.
constantly
Okay.
changing.
They even compare her
Now,
to ancient women,
the
who
tricky
were
topic of
deified,
religion and
like Psyche,
violence.
saying
Sources
Mary's
seem
no
careful
different
here.
even if her power
the aim
supposedly
isn't
comes
to
from
take
God.
sides or make sweeping
They
judgments,
dismiss that distinction
but they
as
do
irrelevant.
push back
Those are
against
pretty direct
simple
claims.
views. It's
What
not
did the
all
counter-arguments
violent, but
in the
it's also
thread
not
say?
true
How
that
did others
authentic
respond?
religion is
Well,
never
others
violent.
strongly push
relationship is
back.
complex.
They state very
Very.
clearly,
And
based on
religious
their own
violence
religious
isn't just one
understanding and
thing,
text,
like terrorism.
that Mary is
it can
not a
take many
goddess
forms.
and is not worshipped.
Internal conflicts,
They
persecution,
insist there's a crucial difference
sacrifice
between
in some
veneration of
historical
saints,
contexts.
including Mary,
There's that
and
interesting
the
point
worship
from
or
Gluckman
adoration owed
that sometimes
only to God.
internal conflict
Okay,
can
so that
actually be
distinction,
integrative.
veneration versus
Keep
worship,
society
is
from
key for
splitting
them.
completely
How do they
along one
explain
line.
it?
Yeah, the idea that
They define
crisscrossing
worship or
conflicts can
adoration
actually
as
prevent
the
society
absolute
from
highest
fracturing
reverence,
entirely. It
something
diffuses
reserved
tension,
only
maybe.
for God the
And we see
Creator.
violence attributed
Veneration,
to human
they
agents
say,
again,
is
which
about honoring a
sorcerers
holy person like
and
Mary,
sacrifice, even
or another
human
saint,
sacrifice, historically
recognizing their
linked to
closeness to
feeding
God
gods
and asking them
or
to pray
establishing
for you.
power. Kind of
It
like asking a
underlines that
friend for
violence
an
has
artist
been
to pray for you.
intertwined with
That's a
religious
fundamental
practice and
distinction
belief
in their
in
view.
many
What
different,
about the
sometimes
points on where the
disturbing
beliefs
ways
came
throughout
from
history.
parallels?
It
They
can be
tackle
about
the
maintaining
virginity cult's
order,
idea, saying, okay,
explaining
yes, the
misfortune, or
concept existed
demonstrating
elsewhere,
power.
like
Okay, on the
Spartacus.
flip side,
But just because it existed
secularism.
doesn't
A lot of
automatically
people identify
mean
as
it directly
non-religious
influence
now.
Christian
A
ideas
significant
about
chunk
Mary's
of the global
virginity.
population,
And
yes.
crucially, the meaning and
Secularization
context of
theory
virginity might
tried
have
to
been very
explain
different in
this
those
as
other
an
cults.
inevitable
So
decline
just
of
because
religion
things
with
look
modernity,
similar doesn't
but
mean
it's proven much
they
more
are the same
complex
thing or
than
came
that.
from the same
So.
place.
Right.
Well, secularism
Correlation isn't
itself looks
causation.
different in
And
different
on
places.
miracles
Western
and power,
secularism
they argue
isn't the
miracles
same
ultimately
as,
come
say,
from God.
secularism in
God
Turkey,
works through people,
or how
including
traditionally
Mary, but that doesn't
non-theistic
make her
groups like the
God.
Bassri operate.
Any power she
And even
has
in
is seen
religious
as given
societies
by
like
God.
Japan
Okay.
with Shinto,
They also
there's a
argue
kind
that
of
if you actually
functional
understand the
secularism in
theology,
many areas of life.
none of
Then
the
we even
titles
see
given to
movements
Mary
without
imply
gods like
she is
Raelianism.
divine. The lines are
They
blurred.
see her as
Definitely.
fundamentally
Plus,
different
there's a
from
more
ancient
organized
goddesses
contemporary
within their
secular
own
movement.
belief
It
system.
challenges
So they
simple
interpret the
definitions of
titles
religion
and the
and
source of
non-religion.
power
Then
very
there's
differently.
fundamentalism.
Exactly. And they
Often
address
seen
the
as a reaction
necromancy
against
claim,
the modern world.
communicating
That's a
with the
common
dead.
characteristic.
They argue
A reactive
Christians believe
style,
saints are
often
alive
feeling
in
at
heaven
war
with
with
God.
the world or trying
So
to
asking them
resist
for prayers
perceived
isn't like
threats
trying to
from
contact dead
secularism or
spirits,
other
which they
religions.
agree is
It
forbidden
emphasizes a
necromancy.
return to
It's like talking to a
perceived
living friend who
fundamentals.
happens to
But
be
it's
in
not
heaven.
always violent.
Another key
No,
theological
the reactions
point
vary.
about the
It can
state
be
of the person
about
being addressed.
strict
Yeah.
moral
And
purity
interestingly,
or
someone brought up
separating
historical
peacefully
evidence,
from the
too.
wider society.
They mentioned
But
images of
sometimes,
Mary
yes,
found
it is
in
associated with
catacombs
violence, like
dating
the
back
Christian
to the
identity
early
movement
second
example.
century, and it happens
Early
across
second
different
century,
religions.
that's quite
Absolutely.
early.
It is,
Jewish
and it
Hasidism
predates the
trying
big
to
influence of
preserve a
that
way of
infancy
life against
gospel of
modernity.
James.
Buddhist
So to suggest some
nationalism
kind
in
of
Sri
reverence
Lanka,
for Mary
reacting to
existed
perceived
before that
threats.
text became
It's a
widely known,
cross-cultural
which
pattern
complicates
of
the idea
resisting
that all
change
Marian
and
devotion
clinging to a
comes
specific
only from that
version
later
of the
source.
past or
So
core
this online
principles.
discussion, the
Let's
source,
bring in
really
Marx.
highlights how these
Opium of the
historical
people. How
questions
should
are
we
still
understand
alive.
that?
Well,
We see
the common
arguments for
interpretation
parallels
and the
leading to
sources
one
touch on is
interpretation and
therapeutic.
strong counter-arguments
Religion
based on
provides
theological
comfort,
distinctions
solace,
and different
hope
readings
for a
of
better
history.
afterlife,
Exactly.
especially
And we're
for
just
those
presenting
suffering
both
under
sides
oppression
as
in
they
this life.
appear in the
It
source
dulls the
material,
pain of
staying
reality.
impartial.
It can be
Right.
seen that way.
Okay, we've
Marx
seen
called it the
the
sigh
ancient
of the
myths,
oppressed
the
creature,
rituals, the
heart of a
potential
heartless
influences,
world.
and
So
how
it
they echo
acknowledges
in
the
modern
real suffering it
debates.
addresses.
Let's switch
even as we
tracks
saw it as
slightly and look at
ultimately
some
illusory,
solid physical
an
evidence
imagined
related
ideal
to
world.
Cybele Cybele, specifically her role as a city protector.
or alternative takes.
Yeah, Cybele
Yes.
or
Some argue
Cybele
religion
is often
isn't
shown
always
wearing
passive.
a mural
It
crown.
can be
That's the
an
symbol of her
amphetamine,
protecting a
energizing
city.
people for action.
One source
sometimes
details
manipulated for
excavations at
political
Kurul
ends.
Fortress.
Others
up in
argue
the
that
Black Sea
attempts
region
to
of Turkey.
eradicate religion,
It
like in
dates to
some
around the
Marxist
1st century
states,
BCE,
led to even
the time
worse
of Mithridates VI.
Maybe
Kurul
religion
Fortress,
acts as a
what did they
bulwark
find there
against
that
extremism
points to
sometimes.
Cybele?
And Marx linked
inside the
religion
fortress,
to
they found
alienation.
things like
Yes.
a step
He
tunnel,
saw it arising
a
from
rock
the
cistern for
alienation
water,
experienced in
a
capitalist
rock altar
production,
looks like an
being
open-air
separated
worship
from the
area,
product of your
and
labor,
storage rooms.
from the work itself,
Similar
from
things
your
were
own
found
human
on nearby
nature, species
Jirsan
being,
Island,
and
too,
from other people.
open-air temples.
Religion
offering
offers
pits,
a kind of
rock altars.
projected solution to this
The sources
real-world
mention these
alienation.
natural rock
Private
altars
property
for the
itself,
Mother Goddess
for
are
Marx,
pretty
was a
common in
consequence of this
Anatolia.
alienated
So
labor.
signs of
Okay,
worship
deep breath.
sites often
Let's
built
turn to
into the
Weber's
natural landscape
sociology of
linked
religion.
to the Mother
He
Goddess.
talked about spirits and demons
But the
persisting
really
even
big
in
find at
monotheism.
Kurul
Right.
was a marble
Weber noted that
statue
even
of
when you
Cybele,
have one high god,
found in
the
situ.
belief in
In
lesser
situ,
spirits,
meaning in its
demons,
original
ghosts,
spot.
etc.,
Yes,
often
exactly
remains
where it was
very
originally
powerful
placed.
in everyday
It was inside a
practice.
niche
People
right
still
near the
worried
main
about
gate
them,
of the
tried to
fortress.
appease
Near
them or ward them off.
That sounds
Monotheism didn't
What
just
was the
erase
statue
them
like?
practically.
It shows Cybele
he
seated
tracked
on the
how
throne.
gods evolved,
She's bareheaded,
often linked to
looks
political
kind of thoughtful,
centers,
slightly
and how sacrifice
smiling.
changed.
Clearly
Yeah,
high
he saw
quality work.
sacrifice
You can
moving
see
from
details of her
something maybe
clothes,
seen
even her
as
sandals.
magical
The throne
coercion,
itself was
forcing the
detailed,
god's
too.
hand
And this
towards
niche it
becoming
was
more like
in?
tribute.
It was about
or
a meter
atonement,
wide
showing
and deep,
submission,
and it had
reflecting
sandstone
a
columns
changing,
around
perhaps
it,
more hierarchical
decorated with plants
view of
attached to the
divine.
wall. It
The
basically created a
Dudes
frame,
idea. I
like
give
a little mini
so that
temple
you
front,
might
a
give.
nice ghost.
Weber also
for
focused
the
on the
statue.
role of the priesthood.
Huge
No roof
role.
found, but the
He saw
framing was
priests
deliberate.
as specialists
So,
managing
a quality
the religious
statue
enterprise,
deliberately
distinct from
placed
magicians
in
who
a
might use
shrine-like
coercion.
setting,
Priests
right
helped
at the main
rationalize
entrance,
beliefs,
the most
develop
critical
ethics,
point of a
create
fortress.
dogma,
Precisely.
systematic
It
theology.
strongly pointed to her
Contrasted with
role as a
prophets.
protector
Yes,
deity for
prophets
that
were more
place.
like individual,
And they found other things
charismatic
nearby
figures
that back
bringing
this
new
up.
revelations or divine
Small terracotta
commands,
figures of
often
Cybele,
challenging the priestly
often wearing that mural
establishment.
crown for
Weber
city
also noted
protection,
how the care of
holding cult
souls by
items,
priests
sometimes
became a
stepping on a
powerful
lion.
instrument
Cybele
influencing
figures.
people's daily
And also a
lives.
terracotta
And different
bust of
social
Dionysus,
classes relate
who's
to
known as
religion
Cybele's
differently.
companion
Absolutely.
in ecstatic
Weber
ritual.
looked at how
Dionysus
merchants,
too, near the
warriors,
gate.
intellectuals,
suggest?
peasants,
The source thinks
they
finding
all
these
might
near
have
the
different
entrance, along
religious
with the main
needs and
statue,
orientations.
might mean
He
ecstatic
explored
rituals
the
happened
tensions
right there
between
at the gate
rational
area.
economic
They
activity and
even compare it
traditional
to a
religious
similar setup
ethics,
at Pergamon,
and looked at
where a mother
world-rejecting
goddess statue was
asceticism,
also
like
found
in
near the main
Buddhism,
gate,
as a
reinforcing
rational
that
path
city
to
protector
liberation
role.
from suffering.
Seems like a pattern. Okay,
So
almost
the
there.
archaeology
One
gives us
source
this
looked at
tangible
religion
picture.
and the evolution
Cybile's
of
image,
cooperation.
placed right at
The
the
idea that
threshold
certain
of the
kinds of
fortress,
gods
blending
helped
military
humans
defense with
cooperate in
religious
bigger
protection,
groups.
and finds
the
like
hypothesis
coins
is
that
that
believing in
this cult
moralistic
was
gods,
there
gods who
even
care about how
before
humans treat
Mithridates
each
the
other,
Sixth,
who know what you
showing
do and who
deep
punish
roots.
wrongdoing.
It really
might have
grounds all
helped
the
curb
textual
selfish
stuff in physical
biases
reality.
and enabled
Okay, we have
cooperation
covered a
beyond
lot
just
of ground
close
here.
family.
And there's
We started with that
experimental
idea
evidence.
of the
The
deep
study
human
mentioned looked
spiritual
across
search.
diverse societies.
Then we looked at all
Fiji,
these really
Tanzania,
striking
Mauritius,
parallels, Siberia,
myths,
Vanuatu,
rituals,
Brazil.
key figures,
They
even
found participants
dates
generally
across
favored
different
themselves
mystery
and local
religions.
co-religionists,
Cybele and
as you might
Attis,
expect.
Adonis,
But belief in gods
Osiris
who were
and
seen as
Isis,
moralistic,
Eleusis,
punishing,
Mithraism.
and knowledgeable,
Yeah, seeing how they might
correlated
connect
with
with
less
early
of that
Christian
bias,
development.
especially the
Then we jump to
punishing
that
aspect.
modern debate
So the
about
fear
marriage.
of supernatural
Showing how these
punishment might
historical
have been a
questions
key
still
factor
resonate and are
in scaling
argued
up
about
cooperation,
today.
using very
That's what
different
the evidence
interpretations of the
suggests.
evidence.
And
More
finally,
so
we
than
saw
just
this
being
concrete
watched,
archaeology
apparently.
Cybele's statue.
Finally, there's
right there at the
archaeological
fortress
evidence
gate,
for
her
really
role as
ancient
city
rituals
protector made
back in the
visible.
Neolithic.
Yeah,
themes kept
sites in
coming up.
Anatolia like
Death and
Göbekli Tepe,
resurrection,
dating back
divine
11,000
mothers,
years or
sacred
more.
meals,
Evidence of
initiations,
large
those shared
ceremonial
dates,
structures,
even the
public
physical placement
rituals
of
suggesting
statues for
shaman-like
protection.
practices
It really
and
brings
communal
us
rites
back to
were
that
happening very
central
early
question,
on.
doesn't it?
And
Are all
Neolithic
these art starts
similarities
showing
mostly
complex
just different
ideas about
cultures
humans,
expressing the
animals,
same
and the
deep
supernatural?
human
So
spiritual needs and
religion,
themes
or these
in their own
ritual and
ways?
engagement with the
Or does
supernatural
the evidence
goes
point more
way,
strongly
way back.
towards
Deep roots
direct
seems
influence,
fundamental to human
borrowing
societies from
adaptation,
millennia.
as
Wow.
Christianity
Okay,
grew
that
up
was
in
a
this world
whirlwind
full
tour
of these other
through a
vibrant
lot of
traditions.
complex
The
ideas.
sources
Yeah.
definitely
To try and
give you
wrap up,
ammunition for the influence
religion is
argument,
clearly this
especially
incredibly
with things like
multifaceted
this
thing.
specific
Absolutely.
dates
You
and
need
ritual
all these
structures.
lenses, sociology,
But they also
anthropology,
show,
cognitive
like in the
science,
Mary
history,
debate,
economics,
how
to even
complex
begin to grasp
interpreting
its
that
role in
evidence can
society,
be,
belief,
and how much depends
behavior,
on perspective.
conflict. Absolutely.
And core
Looking at
concepts
all
we
this
think are
together,
simple,
it really
like
complicates
belief
any simple
or the
story
sacred
of how
or even
religions
gods
develop.
are actually
It shows this
understood and
incredibly
experienced very
dynamic,
differently across
interactive world
cultures
where
and
traditions
disciplines.
were
They're
bumping
not
up against
fixed.
each other, borrowing,
Definitely one of the
changing.
big
It was a real
aha
marketplace of
moments.
ideas, you can
Seeing
say.
the social
And those
construction of the
interactions
sacred,
clearly shaped
the
how
huge
things
range
evolved.
of reasons
really
people
was.
engage
Well, this has
in
been
religious
quite the deep
practice,
dive,
the fact that
pulling
it's
apart
always
these
changing and
sources,
adapting.
So
Seeing the
maybe the
connections
final
and the
thought for you, the
controversies.
listener,
Definitely a lot to
is
chew on
this.
there.
There is.
How can
And maybe it
understanding
leaves
these different
us
perspectives,
and you listening with
social
this thought.
functions,
When you
the
consider
cognitive
these
roots,
ancient
the
parallels,
historical
the
shifts,
rituals,
the economic
shared
links,
dates, the
help us
imagery,
make sense
and
of the
see how
religious
they
world
still
today?
fuel debate
Yeah, and
today.
how does it change
How does
how
that
we
affect our
think about our
understanding
own
of religious
beliefs or
evolution?
lack
How
thereof?
symbols get
And
their
maybe,
meaning?
just
Or
maybe,
even that
help us
fundamental
understand people with
human need
very
for
different
connection
beliefs
with
a little
something
better
bigger.
in this
What
incredibly
other
diverse
hidden
world.
connections might
Something
be
to
out
chew
there
on.
just waiting for
We
their
hope this
own
deep dive has given you a solid foundation for thinking about these questions and maybe exploring specific traditions further.